oil prices, get completely decimated at the time, and the competition became really stiff because everyone was cutting costs and looking at how to become more competitive. And so we're launching this airline at the same time as when the economy itself wasn't doing fantastic. And I had come in, with this grand vision of building this airline that would serve Nigerian businesses. And so I had to find a way to motivate the team, inspire the team, still find all the people we needed, build this airline, get it funded, and then sort of launch. And luckily it's still been around for the last 5 years, 6 years, and I hope it stays that way even during this downturn. And then moving on to Andela, which is I joined Andela in 2016, a very small company at the time, and I think we're about maybe 150 employees, 200 employees total. So that's in contrast with today, where we're closer to 1,500 employees. And I joined also in the middle of a bit of a crisis in Nigeria at the time. And so a huge part of my job coming in was to essentially turn around the culture as a starting point, and then also move us from being a startup that was everyone's family, and if you don't get the work done, it's fine, and we can just sort of talk around it, to being really performance driven, being very clear on goals, objectives, outcomes, measuring performance, and then also both rewarding people and also penalizing people, which I think at startups at times it's hard to strike a good balance between those two things. And so over time, I've really been just exposed to what makes companies succeed during times of crisis, and also what makes teams struggle and sometimes fail during times of crisis. Now, the big disclaimer here is there's an element we can't speak to here, which is around the market itself. So in a rising market, everyone sort of wins, no matter how, let's say, subpar your management is. And in a very, very, very challenging market, if you lose all your customers, then it is very hard to survive. So I'm not here preaching that the principles we discussed today will automatically save everyone from having a challenging experience during this global, potentially what looks like a global downturn. But I think there are ways to stem the challenges. There are ways to be productive and still be very effective. And there are ways to increase the chances of you being successful and coming out of this on the other side, not bruised as much as other people would be. So I think that is the general background for sort of why I think it's important to be here, sharing some of my experiences with this group. I see some familiar names in the attendee list, so that's exciting. So let me pause there for 1 second so everyone can digest that. And I think what I'll do is then spend another 3 or 4 minutes just quickly talking through very high level bullet points around how I think about the 2 or 3 major areas of managing a remote team during a time of crisis and trying to maintain performance. What are the 3 broad categories, and what are some of the sub bullets below those? So I'll pause there, let everyone digest, and then we can jump in. Okay, so for me, I think the 3 big things I look at are: 1 is management, 2 is communication, and 3 is culture. I think all leaders need to be thinking through these 3 things. Now, in some other contexts, people will tell you, strategy, people, and operations. I think during times of, when the ships are sailing, when the tide is high, yes, that I would lean more towards strategy, people, operations as my sort of 3 pillars of running a business. When we're in more of crisis mode, I go into management, communications, and culture. And that's because, as I explain in a second, these become your toolkits to really, really anchor in and figure out how to get the team to produce the right results. So in terms of management, this is, from speaking to a bunch of friends who are entrepreneurs, a bunch of other managers, both at my company, at previous companies, friends out there who are running businesses. It's, in many cases, it's actually not very clear what the goal is. If you sit every employee down today and say, hey, what are the goals of our business? Many of them will give you different answers. So I think step 1 is really just clarifying what the goal is. Is it very clear to everyone? And are you making sure that you are cascading those goals across teams, across departments, and that everyone actually knows what they're supposed to be doing to contribute to those goals? So that's number 1. If you don't know what you're playing for, then most people will not actually be able to play well. The second thing, which is, again, sounds extremely trivial, and most of these things will be trivial, but people don't do them often enough, is what's the measure of success? So if we use a football analogy, and I stole this idea from someone else who was giving a presentation, and they started using football analogies. Everyone seemed to love it. So let me try that. If you're playing football, then you don't just tell the team, if you're the coach or the captain, you don't just say, hey guys, we need to play really well. I need everyone here to give in their best efforts, and everyone here, should play well so we can win. That's good, but that isn't necessarily good enough. So in most cases, you'll have a clear measure of success. Sometimes it's just like, hey, you know what? We need to score more goals than the other team scores against us. That's the goal. So if it's 5-4, great. If it's 1-0, great. And then sometimes when you actually need a goal difference, where you're like, hey, we need to score more goals, and we also need to maintain a certain goal difference because we're competing against other people that are not necessarily in this match. And in that case, you have to be very specific on what the goal difference is, so the whole team knows. In some cases, you're saying, hey guys, this is a defensive play. Our job in this game is not to concede any goals. So I need you, and you to basically protect us. And so you basically have different strategies that would be based on knowing exactly what the measures of success are. For a lot of businesses I've talked to and worked with, people actually don't know what the company's KPIs are, or they have 20 or 30 KPIs, and therefore it's very difficult for people to know, what are the priority things. So ideally, right now, you should have 3 things that you're measuring every single month, and those are the 3 things that everyone in the company knows. And you can sort of like put that on the screen when you have the company calls, and everyone can see how you're doing. So that's the second thing. 1 is what's the goal. 2 is how do you measure success? Is it very clear? And 3 is how do you performance manage? And so performance management is really, if I know what I'm trying to arrive at in terms of outcomes, what are the techniques that I'm going to use to get people to deliver towards those outcomes? And so we can talk through some of this, but I highly recommend, especially in time of crisis, team meetings, sort of progress reviews where you're reviewing actual deliverables that are meant to be done, and having people give updates and creating a shared accountability. As a leader, when I go into a meeting with my team, they're not just presenting to me, they're presenting to the whole team. And so if people are not delivering value, they are not delivering value for the team. And even before I speak, others on the team might jump in and say, hey, look, this is not what we agreed to last time. I saw that work really, really well when building the airline. I've seen that work really, really well here. I've seen other leaders apply this approach, and it's worked extremely well for them. And so the question then becomes, what tools do you use to review your deliverables and initiatives? And I think we'll be able to chat through some of that. Under management, another thing I believe is really, really, really important today is leaving room for people to talk about personal things. Everyone here is going through stuff. I think some of us have colleagues who have families and kids. They're stuck at home now. Some people don't have enough space for them to actually create their own work environments. And so, one thing I've seen on my teams and again across different organizations is people have personal lives, family, other things that are going on beyond work. And we don't actually understand the stresses that puts on people and how it affects how they show up to work. And so leave space, in a one-on-one conversation, which, if you manage a team of 5 people, you want to be having one-on-ones with them at least every 2 weeks. It could be a 30-minute one-on-one, it could be a 1-hour one-on-one, but you're basically saying, hey, this is time for you as my direct reporter, as my team member, to speak to me about anything that's on your mind. Doesn't have to be an agenda, doesn't have to be a script. We can talk about whatever it is that you want to talk about. And then encourage them by asking questions. How are you doing? How's your family? How's life? Again, sounds extremely trivial, but in the middle of grinding and trying to get results, many times leaders will forget this. So that's sort of like number 1 around management. I think the final point I raise on management is your approach will depend on the seniority of your team. So right now I manage a team of vice presidents. I can't micromanage them. I can't be asking them for status updates every day. That would be extremely frustrating. And so the way I manage here is very different from the way I managed, 3 years ago as director of operations at Andela. Is very different from the way I managed a team of 6 people at an airline who were helping me to launch it. With very senior leaders, you're probably managing towards weekly outcomes. You're sort of committing to things that will get done on a weekly or bi-weekly basis, and you're managing towards that. For one of my teams, it's as simple as every Friday, I get an email from them that lists all the different areas that we've agreed on as our deliverables for the month or for the quarter, and an update on what's going on in each of those areas. And then I can dig in on any particular questions I have by email. And then we have a weekly meeting where, I've read the email, I've gone back and forth with them. And then during the weekly meeting, we're focusing on blockers, we're focusing on areas where we need to dig in. If you're leading very junior people, you probably want a daily stand-up at this time. So stand-up is basically a 15-minute meeting. Everyone literally stands up, and you don't have to do that, but software engineers do that a lot. The reason why people stand up is because when you're standing, it's hard to talk for 2 hours, and so people get to the point. But you basically will go through everyone on the team giving a quick update on what they're working on and where things are at, and then you wrap up the meeting in 15 minutes. If you're leading a junior team, I advise doing that twice a day. It's like morning stand-ups and later in the day stand-ups, because one of the biggest problems during crisis is people just will get distracted, and so you might go for 3 or 4 days without the work being done, and then you find out on day 4 that you have to come back in and start problem solving. And if you're a startup, then you have to tailor this thing to your needs, but you might also approach this from a, every day we're meeting, with the startup team and doing daily sprints or weekly sprints. So that's number 1 on management. Number 2 on communication. Many of us are going to be in a position where we will have some challenges in business, right? Because the global economy is taking a big hit, and most companies are not exempt from what is going on today. For example, if your business serves the hospitality or travel industry right now, you're probably getting decimated for the next few months. I have friends whose revenues have gone down to 0, literally, like no revenue at all already. And I have some friends who are okay because their businesses will be the last ones to get hit, because they're running like, sort of core food, beverage, other core human needs. And so I think the first thing is be honest about your situation and understand your situation. If you are somebody who is going to thrive during a crisis, fantastic, you're 0.001%. And maybe this is a great time for you to communicate to the team that you can actually gain advantages over your competition. If you're a business that is likely going to suffer a bit, you should also be very honest with your team, because building that trust is what will allow them to then, make sure they're aligned to the goals and execute. I think without context, people are not empowered to empathize with what the business is going through. Decisions you make will be questioned if people don't understand why you're making them. And also, in many cases, if people know what is going on, they will actually be the ones suggesting things to you, because if they know we're trying to save money, for example, they'll be saying, hey, look, I've seen these 3 or 4 areas that we probably could get cost savings. And so, I'd like to suggest that. So I think that's number 1, is be honest with them. 2 is just let them know what types of decisions you're likely have to take if things get really tough. 3 is make a lot of space to answer questions. We do monthly town halls in every country at Andela. At previous organizations I was in, I wouldn't name one of them in particular, we rarely had town halls, and when we had them, they were not really productive because management just came in and would just always lie to you. And so at some point, I even stopped going to those town halls because it just wasn't useful for me. And so I think make space to answer questions, be very direct and honest with people if you can. And then all of my assumptions here is that you've already built some level of trust with your employees, right? If you're in an organization where people don't trust you because over time they haven't felt like you're candid, I think some of these things are a bit more tricky to do during a crisis. If you don't have that yet, crises are mostly really, really great opportunities to develop that trust with your team, because everybody is actually worried. And so this is one of those few times when you can get everyone together, build a shared sense of going through this struggle together, create an external enemy. People always unite when there's an external enemy. This is a perfect time to have an external enemy. And we actually can name and sort of put a name on this enemy. It's a virus, but it's an enemy nonetheless. And so you can galvanize your whole team to fight against the situation we're in. And I think over communicating during times of crises is really, really important. So, whether it's Slack or emails or WhatsApp groups, whatever you use, your team over communicate, send articles about productive stuff, not about coronavirus. I think there's too much of that going on already. Just educate people, provide them with context, provide them with content, let them know that you're thinking about them. And, hopefully that helps to build a sense of shared alignment towards goals. And I think the last thing is culture. I won't speak about culture very much unless it comes up in the questions. But I think one of the most important pieces on culture I've read is from Ben Horowitz of Andreessen Horowitz, and he basically said, look, culture is not that important, yes, because if a company is doing really well, then it doesn't matter what your culture is. But when things go tough, and things will always get tough, then the culture you've built will show itself. And so right now, all of us are about to know what the true culture of our companies are, because the way people behave, the way they align towards goals, the way they execute, the integrity they bring to work, and the passion they bring to work, this is when we really know if we have committed people who buy into the vision or if we don't. And so kind of keep an eye out for your culture. This is the best time to know what your company culture is. And also whatever you plan to have people believe in terms of your culture, this is a time for you to show that as well and live those values that you expect others to live. So let me pause there. I feel like this is a lot. And I don't want to just sit here and talk at people. So I'll pause there. I think we can take some questions and turn this into a discussion. So Precious, over to you to let us know how to approach this section.
Okay. Thank you, Seni. Can everyone hear me? So I actually have a specific question about management. So you talked about how you're managing a senior team now with vice presidents. So when you're managing a senior team who are then managing their individual teams, we're hearing a lot about empathy now.
Quick check. Okay, there you are. All right.
Yeah. So we're hearing a lot about empathy now. And I was wondering, is there a way for senior managers or someone like you to kind of balance having empathy for the VPs that you're having, who also need to have empathy for the individual team members? Like, how do you balance that, being empathetic and being strategic?
Yeah, so, I probably lean really far in one direction here. And some people may not agree with my own management philosophy on this topic. But I think it's very similar to, any savings account, if you will, for individuals or economies, right? If you can just put a little bit of money every day into the piggy bank, then the day you need to withdraw, you can actually withdraw lots. And so my approach is always, way before any issues come up, a core part of my management is empathy. Like I care about the heart as much as I care about the head. And so for me, performance is really about people being in the right mental state, and then also people being very, very clear on goals and achievement. And so I have very high expectations, but I also match that with very high empathy. So on an average week, a year ago, for example, if I get together with one of my direct reports, so I think for context, my direct reports are all country directors in Nigeria, Kenya, Uganda, Rwanda, Egypt, and they're all sort of seasoned executives. Some of them have run countries before for businesses. They're all in their 40s mostly, and so they're people that have worked for a while. In any conversation we have, I will always either start or end with how are you doing and what's going on in your world. So we've had, literally over the course of 1 year, we've had at least 15 conversations where I've asked them how they're doing and actually engaged around how they're doing. And so when we're in a crisis and I say, how are you doing? It's actually very authentic. People know I'm not just making it up. And I think what that does is it allows people to bring, I've heard stories that are kind of incredible about, when I say, how are you doing? And people tell me things that if I didn't know that, I could never understand how to get them to perform better. I could never understand how to engage with them on areas where there might be some gaps, or areas where they might have a blind spot, or areas where I might have a blind spot as well. So, I think empathy is just a fundamental thing that managers need. And the simple way to start displaying empathy is just by asking people how they're doing, and then listening to what they say, and then engaging around that conversation. And then if people see any adjustment in the way you engage with them based on that conversation, they'll know you listened, they'll know you actually are taking that seriously, they'll know you act on it. And as a result, they'll be more likely to talk about it more. Now, on the flip side, I know that there are people that have particular work environments where you open that door and it'll lead to floodgates. The minute you ask somebody how you're doing, all of a sudden they're bringing all their problems to your work every day. I think you also have to have a very clear, professional sort of bar for what is acceptable. And you train people over time, right? Everyone's going to come from a different background, and you train people. The discussions you entertain and the way you engage will train people as to what you're interested in bringing into the office and what you're not interested in bringing in. But I don't think people can deliver value when their team members are not committed emotionally as well. I could be wrong. That's my philosophy. I haven't seen a lot of businesses, do well. Now, Amazon being one of the few exceptions where people, Amazon's culture is really, it's really challenged, but they're doing extremely well. But I would never want to work at Amazon. And so, take it with some grain of salt, I guess. I think you're muted, Precious.
Oh, sorry.
There you are.
I have a question from Chibike. So someone will unmute you and you can ask your question to Seni directly.
Hi, Chibiuke. I just unmuted you, so you should be able to ask a question.
Looks like he's still muted. I can see the mic, the red slash. I guess maybe we can read the question out and then I'll take it.
Okay, so let me read the question out.
Yeah, so he said that how do you communicate to a hardworking team that despite all their hard work, they might still have to take some pay cuts, or your company is making basically difficult decisions that's going to impact their earnings?
Yeah, I think it all starts with the why. Again, when people don't know why, they really, really struggle with their decision. And in many cases, when people know why, they still struggle with the decision. But the one thing that why does for people is it gives them a sense of dignity. So they can understand what's going on and they can explain to their families. If you think about it this way, then when someone gets a pay cut or someone loses their job, the first thing that happens to them is they're embarrassed, they're ashamed, and they have to go back and explain to people why this happened to them. And is it because they're not good employees? Is it because they lack the skills that are needed for the job? Is it their village people? There's always some random thing that people will come up with, right? And so I think if someone can go back home and explain why, and the why makes a lot of sense to everyone else around them, then you've given them a dignity where they can actually walk away with their head high. Similarly, if someone comes up and says like, hey, by the way, I only have half the salary I used to have, and now I can't fund all these, maybe they used to spend money to their parents or other family members, and now they can't. They need to be able to have a why to explain that it's not because I'm a bad person, it's just because I can't. So I think being able to explain the why is the most important thing. The other thing is, as a manager, these conversations, when they affect your team, you have to be in them. Don't punk out and send HR and you're somewhere else hiding. If you have to go to your team and say, look, we have a situation on our hands where we cannot afford the cost structure that we have as a business. One, you might ask your team for ideas. I know many people that have sat down with their teams in a room and said, hey, look, what are your best ideas for how we can save money? And people have said all the way from, can the executives take pay cuts to, can we also take pay cuts to maybe you should need to lay off some people and then, bring them back if things work out. Like, people are not stupid. So when they have all the information, they know there's not really much else that can be done to manufacture money. And so they'll also engage and have that conversation. It's the worst day of any manager's life. It's the hardest thing to have, but you have to do it because if you don't cut the limb off, you infect the whole body. And so this is where you kind of go from being a peacetime CEO to being a wartime CEO. And as a wartime CEO, you just don't have the luxury of not being able to be decisive. But what you can do while being decisive is carry the team along so they understand that you value them, there's dignity involved, and they'll always get honest conversations out of you.
Thank
if
you.
that doesn't answer the question fully, I'm happy to take a second crack at it, but yeah.
We have a question now from Deji. So Deji, do you want to ask your question to Seni?
Oh, hi Seni.
Hi, Deji.
In a situation where your startup, the state of your startup is not that good before the beginning of the crisis. So the crisis shows up and you are sinking down so fast. What should you do?
Yeah, can you maybe give me a little bit more context? Is it a, just when you say not good, is it more of you haven't figured out?
Yeah, it's what to do. You're looking for funding, looking for co-founder, not sure.
Do you have a business that is generating revenue, or you're still
No.
Okay. Look, just to be very transparent with you, I mean, I think that anything anyone tells you is going to be something that you must take with a grain of salt. However, I think what people can do is give you, one, some responses based on their previous experiences and maybe some research. I know investors today personally who are just holding their cash and they're not deploying money anywhere. No matter how good the idea is, they're not interested because they don't know how long or how deep this global recession is likely going to last. And so they're keeping their money on hand and then they'll deploy in the future, which means, if you happen to be in an environment where that's the majority of the investors that you're trying to raise money from, You could go 3, 4, 5, 6 months and not raise a dime, in which case maybe it's not going to work out, right? On the flip side, I know of 3 companies personally that have raised money and closed their round in the last few weeks. And so, like literally while this thing was happening. And so it is so unique to the individual business that you're running, and whether or not, if you were on the other side of the table, right? Just think about it. If you had cash right now and someone came to you and said, hey, come on, invest in this business, would you think it's a good idea? Or would you be like, not interested? So I don't want to pretend to have the answer without knowing your industry, without knowing the kind of business you're in. I think what I will say on a macro scale is fundraising right now will be extremely difficult. Some people will be able to raise money, but for the most part, I think most people are going to have to realize that if they can't run their business without additional funding, it's probably going to die.
Wow. Thank you so much.
Yeah, you're welcome. Precious, you're muted again.
Yeah, just to follow up on this question. So for startups that are trying to scale now, they're dealing with managing and responding to this crisis. They're assessing their resiliency and also how effective their teams are. What areas do you think that they should be focused on now in order to remain healthy and achieve scale? So like, what are some strategies that they can?
Yeah, I think this is a time to look inward. So there are times for expansion, there are times for more like contraction. On a broad level, if you're in the hospitality industry, if you're in the restaurant business as an entrepreneur, if you're in a tech business that supports people that are in those industries, for example, then I think by now you should be getting the data that shows you whether, so every business has a sales pipeline, right? If you don't have a sales pipeline and you're running a business that's more than like 3 to 4 months old, go build one. You should be able to forecast some level of predictability around, who are the customers we're chasing after right now. Where are we in the conversation with those customers? And can we predict to a reasonable extent what percentage of a chance do we have of closing a particular deal? So if you're pursuing telcos for business and you look at the top 5 telcos, where are you in the conversation with those 5 telcos? And what are the probability you can actually close a deal? You have to have that sales pipeline today. Now, if you have that sales pipeline and you're already seeing that your sales are getting completely decimated. So again, I give an example of my friend who runs a tourism business and his revenues have gone to 0. And he can see that April, May, and June are going to be 0 revenue months because usually they can predict their revenue 4, 5, 6 months in advance. He can see that there's nothing coming down the line. Nobody's traveling, nobody's staying at hotels, all those things. He has to look inward because now it's basically, what your revenue maximum is going to be. It's going to be what you made in January and February and a little bit of March. And then you're not sure what will come in July, August, September. So you're starting from a point of saying, this is my top line, and I now know what my bottom line is because I know all my costs. And so you start to look inward to say, where can I save money to make sure this business survives during this downturn? I think that's where the concept of, managing your runway comes into play. So you might have savings or you might have profits, and you need to figure out how many months can I survive if my revenue drops to the level that I think it's going to drop to. And then you begin to look very, very inward. So this doesn't feel to me, for most companies, there are going to be many exceptions, but for most companies, this right now isn't going to be a time when you're like, hey, we're going to grow 20%, we're going to grow 50%, we're going to grow 100%. For most companies, this is a time when you say, I'm either going to maintain what I have because I have paying customers who are likely going to keep paying me, or I assume that I'm going to actually lose some customers, or some customers that even have committed to paying me will default on their payments, which means my revenue will be lower than I expected, but I'm planning for the same cost structure, which is then not possible. And then you have to go and look inward to manage the costs. So I think that's really, anyone that tells you otherwise is probably lying to you. Again, unless you're a very niche business that happens to have like a resiliency, if you're a coronavirus testing company, then of course, you're likely going to be growing right now. If you're an online education company, you're likely going to be growing right now. Like Zoom, I think Zoom did a 10x growth on their user base in the last 6 months or so. So there are going to be some businesses that will survive through periods like this. If your business is like that, you will know, because right now you probably already begin to see the growth in your revenue numbers. Or you can pivot into a business that does. But I think for the majority of people, like 60%, 70%, 80% of people, you're likely going to see a limited upside. And now you got to manage your costs so that you can survive through this period and then rebuild when you get past it.
Thank you. So we have a question from Fikayo. Fikayo, you can ask your question, Srini.
Hi, Shani.
I think
I just want to ask a quick question because we've been managing remote workers for a while now. We just started that recently in my organization due to this pandemic, but we are struggling with accounting for 40 hours of work, right? So is it really possible to get 40 hours? Seeing that a lot of people are not used to working from home, it's easy for you to get distracted and all that. And sometimes it seems so unrealistic when I see some reports and you say that, oh, this person worked for 40 hours, and I know that that cannot be true. So is it possible to achieve that? Or yeah.
Can you maybe do me a favor and just tell me what type of industry are you in?
Fintech.
Fintech. Okay, good. All right. So let me back up for a second, and this might end up taking us too far back, but I'll make it very quick. What does 40 hours a week mean? 40 hours a week represents, for industries, the expected number of hours it takes to get the work that needs to be done. And so I think that's the concept that came, many years ago before the time we're in now, particularly around the production line, people manufacturing things and, having to put in, if you're assembling a car, then a car takes X amount of time to assemble. Boiling an egg takes 15 minutes. Doesn't matter whether you have 5 eggs or 10 eggs, or if you're using, maybe there's some new age technology that does that, but on average, boiling an egg takes 15 minutes. So you can't really shortcut that. So if you need to boil a bunch of eggs in sequence, you just take 15 minutes times whatever the number of eggs are that you're boiling in sequence. For me, 40 hours a week doesn't actually mean anything. I'm managing people towards outcomes. So I know what the outcomes are. We align on those outcomes. And as long as we have agreed on those outcomes, if you need to work 20 hours to get there, then that's my fault as a manager for not estimating, how much time my team needs. But also as an employee, if you're working 20 hours a week and you're happy to do that for the foreseeable future, if you're hitting the goals I have as a business, then you're hurting yourself because you're not developing your career the way you should. So I actually put the power back in the hands of my team members and say, this is as much for the development of the business as it is for your personal development. You're not going to be here for the next 50 years. So my expectation is that by the time you spend X number of years on my team, you should be even more marketable outside. So I think that's number one, is 40 hours a week doesn't really mean anything. It's meant to be a representation of something else. And if that other thing is going well, then it doesn't kind of matter to you whether they're spending 40 hours or 20. Many people on my team work more than 40 hours on some weeks. And they don't account for those extra because they know that they might then have a dip in another week. So I think that's number one. Number two is, if you have people on your team where you fundamentally believe that they will be okay, doing 25 hours a week and claiming 40 hours a week every week over and over and over again, then that should be showing up in the quality or the output of their work. And if the quality or output of their work isn't what you expect it to be, you need to have a discussion with them about whether they belong on that team. So I think if you focus on what's the goal, back to what I said about management, if you focus on what's the goal and what are the clear measures of success that we will track towards that goal, and everyone is very clear on what they've committed to delivering towards the goals, it is actually almost impossible to hide. And if someone is so efficient that they can clear out, what someone else would do in 40 hours, they can do it in 20. They buy themselves extra time to read books and hang out with their family. That's fine.
Okay, so we have another question from Preston. So Preston, we've unmuted your mic and you can ask your question.
Hi, Shani. So I know you mentioned, I think I read it in your leaving post, this concept of hiring and rehiring yourself every sort of 6 months to, I guess, to face a new JD that might be in front of you. I wanted to find out, your perspective on how that concept can play out in a situation like this, where essentially I feel, the goal or the work you have to do probably changes to some extent, and how you think about applying that here.
Yeah, that's a great question. So for most people, let me put it this way. If you're running a business, so I think we might have a mix of people on this call, maybe some entrepreneurs who are the CEO of the business, and maybe some folks who are not the CEO, but they're in leadership positions. If you're a leader, whether you're a CEO or someone else, if in the last 2 or 3 weeks or month, you haven't stopped to say, my job is fundamentally different, I'm begging you to do that this weekend or Monday or Tuesday. it is not possible for you to be a leader of a business today where your job is the same as it was 2 months ago. If you're operating in that realm, there's a high chance you're getting ready to kill your company. I'm just going to be very honest and direct about, we're trying to have real talk here, right? So I'll be very direct. Most of us need to have fired ourselves. The version of ourselves from 3 weeks ago needs to be fired. And we need to rehire someone for today. So the person of 3 weeks ago and the person of today need to be different people. Now, unless you're sitting on $1 billion of cash, like you're at Google or someone else, where you can kind of write this out and then come back in the future. If you're most other people where you probably have 2, 3, 4, 5 months of cash on hand at any given time, you're going from peacetime CEO to wartime CEO. Peacetime is where you're focusing on, let's all sort of get together and have a kumbaya, and we're doing it for the culture and we're all happy and all that. Wartime CEO is, yes, we're going to focus on culture, but it's in a way that we're going to ensure we're very transparent to people. Our culture will be a culture of transparency. Our culture will be a culture of having real conversations about things. Our culture will be a culture of speaking about facts, not fiction. Like, dreaming is great, but like right now, we're in a real situation, these are facts. And our culture will be one of not shying away from difficult decisions and performance managing ourselves to be able to get through this journey. And so that's an example of a change that at the most senior level you need to make. And when you're moving from one stage, and so even if you're not CEO, you're a manager, again, as a manager, you're likely beginning to look inward. You're not thinking of like, oh, how do we increase sales by 60%? You're thinking, how do I get my team to deliver on the commitments we have to our customers today? How do I make sure we have operational efficiency where we're spending less money, ideally, to achieve the same results? How do I energize my team, inspire my team, galvanize the team to go and deliver these things? And so things as simple as your calendar need to reflect that. What are the things on your calendar today, and how do they reflect where your energy needs to be focused on? Are you doing 60% things that you used to do 3 or 4 weeks ago, which should actually be 20% of your time today? Or are you actually the other way around? So my calendar will get changed every 3 to 6 months. Now, what I do, I don't schedule meetings for the year anymore. I know people that do that. You have a recurring meeting with your management team and you schedule it January to December, and it happens every Monday, January to December, and then like it just goes on. I schedule things 3 months nowadays. So I do January to March, and then I put a placeholder in April. And then by April, I revisit it and say, do we still need to have this meeting at this time with these people, or do we need to change things around? So you have to keep constantly reevaluating your situation and then evolving. But I think the calendar is sort of like the first place that if your calendar isn't right, no matter how you try to change things, you're going to just end up in the same cycle.
Thanks, Shini. So we have a question from Olanrewaju. You can ask your question to Shini now.
Okay, hi Shani. Okay, so I was going to ask, what are the steps an organization should take to transition from a time-based assessment structure to like a results-based assessment structure? So we don't work remotely. We usually don't work remotely. So we have our team coming and work on certain projects, but now we've had to immediately move to a remote structure. So obviously, so our management teams are doing a lot of learning to try to figure out how to manage the current team based on results, as opposed to physically seeing them in the office and maybe managing them real time.
Yeah. So let me give a very cheeky and silly analogy, and then I will then work our way backwards to answer your question. If I was to go to any neighborhood in Nigeria today and say, if 3 people can figure out how to get from that place to this other part of the country, and if they arrive there in the next 48 hours, they'll get $1 million. I can bet you they'll get there somehow. Don't know how they'll do it, but even if it means like them getting people along the way to join them so they can share the money with them, they'll find a way to do it. And I think what that means is when the results are very, very clear, and the reward or penalty for either getting to those results or not getting to those results are also extremely clear and attractive, people somehow manage to find their way to get there. So I think the starting point for this conversation is it very, very clear to that person and their manager what it is that they've committed to doing and what success means on that thing they've committed or those things they've committed. I'll give you an example. I currently use it's very simple. There are a lot of technological tools you can use: Trello, Do, Asana, all these things to measure, to list deliverables and initiatives and who owns it and when is it due. That's all great. I use Excel spreadsheets, Google Sheets actually, to be specific. I have a Google Sheet that has the section of what it is that needs to be done, the specific deliverable in the role of what needs to happen there, who the owner is, what the due date is, and what the status of that particular deliverable is. And then I have that, I have about a 20 row sheets that has all these things. Now, that is what my leadership team has committed to delivering over the next 3 months. And I have that every quarter. I do it for 3 months. From there, each of them takes one row, right? So if you're the person that owns this particular deliverable in my sheets, you take that one row and you turn it into its own section and its own deliverables under that. And then that's for your team. And then for your team, you have who the things that are supposed to be done, who owns it, when this person said they're going to get it done, and what's the status of that thing, what's happening with it. And then if that person has other people on their team, they will take a few of the roles on yours, and each of those roles on yours represents what they are going to then drive their own teams to do. And that's literally how this whole thing gets cascaded. And so ideally, if everyone is measuring their team's performance and driving them towards the right outcomes, then it sort of like also cascades back up. When you have that kind of tracking tool, it is actually impossible for people to hide. Like, the people can only make excuses or explain why things didn't get done. Not everything is going to get done, right? You're not going to have 100% completion every single week, but you can then have a conversation. Why didn't this get done? They can say, oh, actually, you know what? Remember how you told me to do this other thing and I prioritized it? Or remember how the business had to make this decision and I reprioritized it? Yeah, that's why I didn't do this other thing. In many cases, they would even be proactive at saying, hey, look, you're asking me to do this other stuff, or we need to do this other thing, and therefore going to deprioritize this one thing that we put on the list initially. And then you can have a dialogue around whether or not that needs to happen. If you're not able to have that conversation with people, then it's one of two things. Either they're junior, which case it's fine. Like, maybe you actually have a startup and you're managing junior people, you're going to be more hands-on. If they're not junior people and they're senior, and you're not able to have those conversations, then that person probably shouldn't be at your team for much longer than 3 months. Maybe when we get past this downturn that you're in, you actually go find a replacement for that person. But tracking work and being able to discuss line by line. You said you're going to do this thing by this date. Before we get to the deadline, how are things going? Are you almost there? Is there a blocker? Do you need my help? And then having the person execute towards the plan is the only way to drive performance on a team overall. There's no other way to get it done. It's actually very simple, but it requires discipline.
Thanks, Seni. So we have a question from Boluwa next. And Boluwa, you can ask the question now to Seni. Also, just a quick time check. We have 8 minutes left.
Okay. Hi, Seni. My name is Boluwa. My company is called Verscom, and I'm the CMO and co-founder. So we're infrastructure technology. We basically do a lot of Wi-Fi. And Verscom has been winding down. We've just been like.
Boluwa, you're breaking up quite a lot, so I can't hear the question.
Corona, we were not even like getting jobs, but
Boluwa, your voice is breaking up quite a lot, so I can't get the question. Hello?
So she actually typed
right,
her question
and now.
Okay, let me go look for the question in the.
So her question was, how do I motivate my team during a pandemic? Business hasn't stopped for us and we've always worked from home, but the pandemic is actually really affecting the energy of her team.
Yeah. So let me give you some random, like, this is one of those ones where there's no formula, but there's like, because everything depends on your company's culture, but there's a general approach. Right now, what are people looking for? People are looking for some level of assurance. You can't provide assurance for everybody because you actually don't know how things are going to play out. So as a manager, as a leader, as a CMO, co-founder, that sucks that you can't provide assurance for everybody, but you can't. And I think actually you have to be honest about that, because people will understand and appreciate it if they also speak to their friends, and their friends also have companies that can't provide them assurances because we're in an environment where no one actually knows what's going to happen. Two, people are looking for community. So if they can't get assurance, they're looking for community. They want to feel like they're part of something. That you can solve for. Some people at Andela have decided to get really creative and do like lunch open hours. So they send a Zoom link. Everybody needs to have video on, and all of them have lunch at the same time, and they talk about whatever it is on Zoom over lunch. And I found this to be fascinating, but it's actually been incredible. People are going in there, doing it, and then commenting afterwards that it was fantastic, it was great. So now even some of our leaders are now doing that as well, where they'll say, oh, you know what, between this time and this time on Thursday, I'm going to be, either having lunch or having tea or coffee, whatever it is. Join me for coffee chats, and feel free to jump in. And people will join and have conversations about whatever it is. And you can have more casual discussions. So you would have been doing that in the office anyway. You can do that on Zoom. So that's the second thing, is sort of community, and people just want to be part of something. I think the third thing is people want to win. Human beings fundamentally want to win. And the way you define victory is actually what really matters. As a leader, it is our job to define victory during a crisis. And the definition of victory in a crisis will be very different from the definition of victory during a huge, high tide when things are going fantastically well for the world. So you've seen teams where they've lost the championship, but the team has celebrated themselves because they know where they came from, right? They were like the crappy school that never ever made it to any tournaments, and all of a sudden, like, they worked really hard and they figured out how to make it work, and they went to the tournament and they came third place. But for them, they didn't care about first, because they're like, we actually made it to the league table, and actually, like, it's like the world has made it, sort of come together for them. We have to define that for our team. So right now, what is it that your business wants to see happen 3, 4, 5, 6 months from now, in order to say, okay, you know what, this was tough, but we didn't die. Like, we actually were able to pull through. Make that very clear to everyone. Even if it's to say, hey, you know what, these particular 3 customers we have, we must retain them during this downturn. And then everyone aligns towards that. And even if you lose everybody else in the world, those 3 customers are going to, whatever it is, just define it and then make it clear, make it measurable, and then have everyone align towards those things, because people desperately want to win. Human beings in general right now feel like they're losing. We're stuck at home. We've got a virus we don't understand completely. Some people are going outside and taking their chances, and but ultimately they want to win. If you can define what winning looks like for them, they'll be able to align towards it. And some people will still end up, in a difficult position, because again, we don't know how things will play out. Okay.
Thank you. So we have a question which I think is interesting. Babs asks, what's your you have a knack for attracting high-performing talent to your organizations. What's your hiring philosophy, and what do you look out for in talent?
Yeah, I look for, in general, people that have points to prove, number one. I think that people that have points to prove will typically go above and beyond what is expected of them. And in many cases, if someone has a point to prove for themselves, I'm not talking about people that have chips on their shoulders, not insecurities, not people that have issues, daddy issues, mommy issues, family issues. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about people that are saying, in my career, I want to be able to demonstrate I'm capable of doing X. And so I'm going to, for myself and for the world, regardless of who my manager is, I want to go and achieve that thing. These are self-motivated people, self-starters that will always deliver value. And so I think that that's a very, very big part of what I look for. My team right now, funny enough, is almost all women, right? I have 2 men on my team. I have 5 women. And so for some reason, I feel like right now, when I was recruiting this group of people, I found that the women I was running into just had a lot more to prove in, thinking like, I'm going to go into the tech sector as a leader. Some of them came from tech already, but different kind of tech. But they wanted to prove themselves as leaders in this particular sector of tech. They had amazing ideas of what they wanted to create and what a good organization looks like, but they wanted to prove that point to the world and to themselves. And so, that's number one. And then beyond that, it's like, people that are good, just like genuinely honest people. I speak to everyone I interview for hours. I take them to dinner. We have 2 or 3 conversations, and I check to see what their soul, like who they are deep inside in their soul. So yeah, hire for people that are self-motivated, hire for people that have good hearts, and then everything is more, obviously they have to have like skill sets to do the job. But I think those first 2 are extremely critical.
Thank you. So we actually have 1 minute left, but one last question.
Okay, last question.
Obda. So Obda, do you want to ask your question to Seni?
Okay, hi Shani. My name is Obiz. I'm a founder of a fashion resale company.
Okay.
So resale basically started from my wardrobe, and then we just sell and take commissions. But the reason why I'm asking this question is because you mentioned, how you can join a small business and it looks like a close-knit family. Oh, today I do this work, tomorrow I don't do this work.
Yeah.
So I've grown from that part when I was just the only staff of the company, and then growing my employee strength, and then you see people just faff around, and then you're trying to juggle between trying to be that strong leader and trying to keep them close and getting the job done.
Yeah.
But the company is beginning to grow to a point where we need to get to the next level. Okay, we're scaling up, but the same set of people can be there. And
Yeah.
so I started changing management. I have a board that advises me. And so I started changing management, but then trying to infuse the new culture of getting more accountable, getting your jobs done,
Yeah.
having a vision of trying to make sure we're very transparent, the people we sell to. You could see lots of employees were very disgruntled about it, they were rebellious about it. So even before this pandemic hit us this bad, I was already looking at having to revamp the team.
Yeah.
Revamp the team, because if I keep the same team, I will never get to where I want to be, because they just feel like, she should calm down, I beg, nobody should stress us kind of feeling, And now we're working from home, it feels like a holiday for a lot of them. So I've gotten to a point where now I'm trying to do a lot of hiring. I'm torn between, if I hire a new set of people that have the skills, like you're saying, are self-motivated, like you're saying as well, how do I build this culture that I want to build? What is the roadmap to building that culture and instilling it, that it becomes part of the team?
Yeah. Oof, that's
So
a much
that
longer.
where I'm going to, I
By
don't
the way,
get
Obi,
frustrated.
sorry to cut you off. So I did have a hard stop at the hour. So let me try to give like the quickest version of my response. This is a much longer conversation because culture is a whole thing by itself. I think that there are probably two books I'd recommend that you buy and read if you can. The first is called High Output Management by Andy Grove, the former CEO of Intel. It's one of the most renowned books on managing teams that I've ever read. And then the other one I'd recommend is probably The Hard Thing About Hard Things by Ben Horowitz. Those two books I think have provided me with some guidance around how to think about this. But ultimately, I think there's a last thing I'll say you should read. It's actually an article I wrote. So this is self-promotion in a sense. I didn't plan to actually talk about this today at all. But it's called Building a High-Performance Team. It's on Medium, so you can check it out. And maybe like DM me on Twitter or something, and we can pick up the conversation from there.
Okay, thank you, Shani, and thank you to everyone for attending. So if you have any follow-up questions, reach out to us. We'll try to see if we can have Shani answer them for you. But thanks everyone for joining. Bye.
Thank you all. It's a privilege. Bye.